Welcome back to the Great and Spacious Building. For over 3 decades, Bishop John H. Koyle's relief mine had been a matter of local faith, sacrifice, and endless digging. We've seen how his 1894 vision provided a tangible prophetic response to the 20th century's greatest economic trauma, the Great Depression, drawing thousands of disillusioned yet deeply faithful Latter-day Saints to his banner. These Koylites saw Koyle not as a dissenter, but as a complementary prophet, preparing the temporal salvation of Zion. But a private revelation is a powerful thing, and when it draws away the resources, loyalty, and labor of thousands of church members, it ceases to be private. It becomes a challenge to the institutional church. Today, we examine the inevitable clash between the charismatic authority of Bishop Koyle and the bureaucratic authority of the First Presidency in Salt Lake City. This is the story of the church's reaction, the inquiries launched, and the painful ecclesiastical process that forced Koyle and his followers to choose between the voice of a local seer and the voice of the central priesthood. This episode reveals a perennial tension in Mormon history. What happens when an inspired individual's revelation contradicts the unified voice of the presiding quorums? The church leadership sitting in Salt Lake City initially tolerated Koyle. For years, he was simply a hardworking bishop with some peculiar ideas. He wasn't teaching anything heretical about basic doctrine, and the mine was located far from the centers of power. However, the Great Depression changed everything. As the Koyle movement surged, the contributions to the mine in time, labor, and money began to eclipse local donations to the church's official welfare and building funds. Furthermore, the Koylites' unwavering belief in the imminent collapse of the U.S. government and currency flew directly in the face of the church's attempts to integrate into mainstream American life. By the 1930s, the Koyle phenomenon became too large to ignore. The First Presidency, then led by Heber J. Grant, began receiving reports of Bishop Koyle's activities and the deep devotion of his followers. The church's strategy was initially one of investigation and private warning. They weren't just concerned about Koyle, they were concerned about the precedent his successful, independent prophetic project was setting. If Koyle could gather followers and resources based on a private vision, what stopped any other local leader from doing the same? It was a threat to the centralized priesthood correlation system. The First Presidency sent investigators, and Ogden Kraut in his biography notes the constant, sometimes clandestine, pressure Koyle faced. A quote from Kraut's biography: "As the fame of the mine grew, so did the scrutiny. Bishop Koyle was visited by apostles and other general authorities who inquired strictly into the nature of his revelations, the financing of the mine, and the temporal promises he was making the saints." End quote. The investigators found that Koyle was personally honest and not profiting from the work. This complicated the matter. It was not therefore a case of fraud, it was a case of misplaced authority. Koyle genuinely believed his vision triumphed all other temporal counsel. In this period, an important distinction was officially drawn. General authorities began to emphasize that only the president of the church receives revelation for the entire church, while local leaders can receive revelation for their stewardships, a ward, a family. Koyle's prophecy was global, concerning the financial salvation of all the saints. This placed his claim in direct competition with the First Presidency's office. Koyle was repeatedly counseled to stop the work or at least cease teaching it publicly. He refused. For Koyle to stop digging was to disobey the explicit commandment the Savior had given to him in 1894. Koyle told his leaders, "I have been called by the Lord to do this work. I did not deny my commission. If you tell me to stop, I can only say that I must obey God rather than man." This is the classic, unavoidable conflict that arises when a church attempts to formalize the bounds of something like individual or personal revelation. As Koyle continued to assert his prophetic authority, the church escalated its response from private counsel to public injunction. In the late 1940s, the First Presidency issued a statement that clearly distanced the church from Koyle's claims. This statement was designed to protect the average Latter-day Saint from what the church viewed as a delusion. The most severe ecclesiastical step is the disciplinary council, what used to be called a church court or a church trial. In 1947, after decades of growing tension, Bishop Koyle was officially tried for insubordination and teaching false doctrine, not concerning core tenets, but concerning his own prophetic status and the temporal fate of the church. The trial was not about whether the gold existed, but about who had the right to prophesy about the gold existing. The charges, as noted in the historical accounts, centered on the following. First, refusal to submit to the counsel of the general authorities. 2, teaching that the relief mine was an essential temporal requirement for the salvation of the church. 3, claiming to receive revelation that contradicted the established channels of church authority. Koyle used his own testimony as his defense, recounting his 1894 vision with unwavering conviction. He believed the church was acting under duress and misunderstanding his true mission. To quote from his testimony and Ogden Kraut's recounting of this, Bishop Koyle stood before the council and reaffirmed every detail of his original vision. He stated that the general authorities had been told of the mine in vision and that they were making a mistake by opposing it. He maintained that his counsel came from the highest source, end quote. However, the institutional church must, by definition, defend the principle of centralized authority. If the system is to work, the First Presidency must be sustained as the sole prophet, seer, and revelator for the entire church. Koyle's claim was a direct structural violation of that principle. The verdict eventually came down, and the verdict was excommunication. John H. Koyle was stripped of his church membership and, crucially, his priesthood authority. It is a moment of deep historical significance. This action formalized the boundary between acceptable personal spirituality and unacceptable independent prophetic action in 20th century Mormonism. Koyle had crossed the line from a charismatic bishop to an unauthorized prophetic claimant. The excommunication served two purposes for the institutional church. It neutralized Koyle's authority, formally removing him from the priesthood hierarchy. It also sent a clear public message to all members that independent, large-scale, temporal prophetic projects are unauthorized and will result in disciplinary action. The official excommunication was a profound shock to the Koyle movement, but it did not destroy it. In fact, for many, it served as a perverse form of validation. Koyle had prophesied he would suffer persecution for the work. His excommunication was simply the final tragic fulfillment of his own prophecies. The church, like the world, had rejected its true benefactor. The Koylites, now fully separated from the main body of the church, became even more solidified as a community of dissent. Their loyalty remained with the man, the prophet who had sacrificed everything for his vision. They continued to fund the mine, work the tunnels, and wait for the final signs. This loyalty highlights a core tension for empirical historians' charismatic movements. What happens when the prophets and the institution part ways? The Koylites answered this question by asserting the supremacy of revelation over hierarchy. They viewed the church leaders as having been blinded by temporal concerns, like institutional debt or public image, and thus incapable of recognizing the true, divinely appointed method of temporal salvation. Ogden Kraut describes this enduring faith of the Koylites in his biography when he states, even after the excommunication, the majority of the miners and shareholders held firm to Bishop Koyle. They believed that the priesthood of God was not dependent on the approval of men, but on the divine commission itself. They knew Bishop Koyle's mission was true, and they saw his suffering as the final test before the Lord would reveal the treasure. End quote. The relief mine became not just a mining project, but a symbol of resistance, a refuge for those who believed that the true, folk-driven, revelatory spirit of early Mormonism had been lost in the church's pursuit of respectability. The mine continued its slow, painstaking progress toward the prophesied gold vault. Koyle, though barred from the temple and the sacrament, continued to act as the spiritual guide and CEO of the Koyle Mining Company until his death. The story of the relief mine's disciplinary action offers a clean empirical look at the boundaries of 20th century Mormon authority. The church didn't condemn the idea of a treasure. They condemned the source of the revelation and the act of independent gathering. It reveals the institutional imperative to maintain a single official prophetic voice. In one generation, the church went from Joseph Smith's treasure-seeking activities being a common practice to John Koyle's treasure-seeking being cause for excommunication. The folk elements were systematically purged, deemed inappropriate for a modern global church. But Koyle's legacy endures. The mine is still there, and the Koylites, a much diminished but still determined group, continue to hold the promise. The faith they demonstrated, decades of labor and sacrifice for a non-profit promised temporal salvation, remains a powerful and poignant chapter in Utah's history. Next week, we'll bring this series to a close by conducting a comparative analysis that gets to the core of the mission of this channel. We'll compare and contrast the actions, methods, and claims of the 20th century seer, Bishop John H. Koyle, with the 19th century founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith Jr. By comparing Koyle's visions, treasure-seeking, and excommunication with Smith's own early life, we will explore the uncomfortable truth that the institutional church had to destroy a piece of its own historical DNA to survive as a modern religion. If you appreciate these empirical and historical looks at the complexities of Mormonism, please subscribe to the Great and Spacious Building. To learn more about the disciplinary council and Koyle's defense, consult the Koyle Relief Mine, a book by Ogden Kraut. There's also the Koyle Relief Mine Part 2 by Ogden Kraut as well. You can also check out the James Talmage papers at the church archives. They are digitized to look at. Next week, we'll finish up with our final episode, a comparative analysis between Koyle and Joseph Smith. Until then, thank you for joining me. Remember that in the search for truth, sometimes the most valuable things are found in the things men chose to leave behind. Have a great week, and I'll see y'all on the flip side.